Kenneth Eugene Smith, convicted murderer, Alabama death row inmate number Z553. On January 25, 2024, he became the first person in the United States to be executed using nitrogen hypoxia. His crime? The brutal murder for hire of Elizabeth Sennett in 1988. His last meal? A simple request declined by prison officials. His final words? Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. But Kenneth Smith wasn't alone in making history that year. In 2024, America's death chambers witnessed something unprecedented. 4 executions, 4 different methods, 4 men whose final moments would reignite one of the nation's most controversial debates. Smith faced the untested horror of nitrogen gas. Kerry Dale Grayson met his end through the same experimental method in November. Travis James Mullis chose lethal injection in Texas. And Taberon Honie fell to Utah's firing squad. Each death carried its own darkness. Each story held secrets that would chill the blood of anyone who dared to look closer. This isn't just about capital punishment. This is about what happens when desperation meets depravity, when love turns to murder, when justice becomes experimentation, and when the final words of dying men echo truths that society doesn't want to hear. 4 men, 4 deaths, 1 year that changed everything. If this story doesn't make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, then nothing will. Smash that subscribe button, hit the bell icon like your life depends on it, and drop a comment below telling me which execution method terrifies you most. Because after today, you'll never look at the death penalty the same way again. Let's dive into the darkness. March 5, 1988, Colbert County, Alabama. The kind of small southern town where everyone knows everyone, and secrets don't stay buried for long. Elizabeth Sennett, a 45-year-old woman with soft eyes and a trusting heart, lay dead in her living room, stabbed 8 times, beaten with a fireplace tool. The scene was chaos. Blood spattered across floral wallpaper, furniture overturned. The medical examiner would later describe it as overkill, the kind of violence that spoke to rage, to personal hatred. But this wasn't personal. Not really. This was business. Charles Sennett C. Oster, Elizabeth's husband, was a preacher, a man of God who stood behind pulpits every Sunday, preaching salvation and righteousness to his congregation. But behind closed doors, Pastor Sennett had problems, money problems, and a $17,000 life insurance policy on his wife that could solve all of them. So he did what any desperate man might do. He hired someone to kill her. Enter Billy Gray Williams, a career criminal with dead eyes and a willingness to do anything for cash. Williams wasn't working alone. He recruited Kenneth Eugene Smith and John Forrest Parker, 2 men from the wrong side of every track in Alabama. The deal was simple. $1,000 each to make Elizabeth Sennett disappear, to stage it like a robbery gone wrong, to give Pastor Sennett his insurance payout and his freedom. On that March evening, Smith and Parker entered the Sennett home while Elizabeth was alone. What happened next was captured only through their confessions and the evidence left behind. They attacked her with knives. She fought back, screaming, begging for her life. They beat her with whatever they could find. The medical examiner would later testify that she suffered immensely before death finally claimed her. But murder has a way of unraveling even the best laid plans. Within days, investigators began poking holes in the robbery story. Nothing of significant value was taken. The crime scene felt staged, too chaotic, too personal for a random break-in. And then there was Pastor Sennett himself. His grief seemed performative. His alibi too convenient. When pressed by investigators, his story began to crack. Billy Gray Williams was the first to break. Facing pressure from police, he confessed everything. The plot, the payment, the preacher behind it all. He gave up Kenneth Smith and John Forrest Parker without hesitation, hoping to save his own skin. Parker folded next, his confession corroborating every gruesome detail. Kenneth Smith, however, was different. He maintained a cold silence at first, then offered conflicting accounts of his involvement. He admitted being present, but minimized his role, pointing fingers at Parker as the primary aggressor. The prosecutors didn't care about the semantics. All 3 men were charged with capital murder. Pastor Charles Sennett, facing the weight of his sins and the prospect of prison, took his own life before he could stand trial. The trials came swiftly. In 1989, all three men were convicted. Billy Gray Williams received life imprisonment in exchange for his testimony. John Forrest Parker was sentenced to death, and Kenneth Eugene Smith joined him on Alabama's death row, condemned to die for a crime that paid him $1,000 and cost Elizabeth Sennett everything. But the story doesn't end there. It never does with death row. John Forrest Parker was executed by lethal injection in 2010. He went quietly, his final words a simple apology to Elizabeth's family. Kenneth Smith, however, would wait 35 more years for his turn. 35 years of appeals, of legal battles, of watching men around him die while he remained in a 6-by-8-foot cell. During those decades, something was changing in America's death chambers. Lethal injection, once considered the humane alternative to the electric chair and gas chamber, was facing a crisis. European pharmaceutical companies refused to supply the drugs used in executions. States scrambled for alternatives, experimenting with untested drug cocktails that led to botched executions and prolonged suffering. In 2022, Alabama attempted to execute Kenneth Smith by lethal injection. They failed. For hours, prison staff jabbed needles into Smith's arms, hands, and legs, searching for usable veins. He lay strapped to a gurney, fully conscious, feeling every puncture, every failed attempt. The execution was eventually called off, but the damage was done. Kenneth Smith had survived his first execution date, and Alabama officials were humiliated. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. In 2023, Alabama approved a new execution method, nitrogen hypoxia. The theory was simple: replace breathable air with pure nitrogen, causing the condemned to lose consciousness within seconds and die peacefully from oxygen deprivation. It had never been done before. No state had ever used nitrogen gas to execute a human being. Kenneth Smith would be the test subject. As January 25, 2024 approached, Smith's legal team fought desperately to stop the execution. They argued it was experimental, cruel, and unconstitutional. Medical experts warned of potential suffering, of the possibility that Smith could experience prolonged agony while suffocating. But the court sided with Alabama. The execution would proceed. On the evening of January 25, Kenneth Eugene Smith was strapped to a gurney in Alabama's execution chamber. A mask was placed over his face, sealed tight. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, stood nearby, praying. Witnesses watched through glass windows, some with notepads, others with tears in their eyes. At 7:53 p.m., the nitrogen began to flow. What happened next would shock the nation. Smith didn't lose consciousness within seconds as promised. Instead, he convulsed violently, his body writhing against the restraints. He gasped for air, his chest heaving. Witnesses described him shaking and trembling for at least 2 minutes. Some said it lasted longer. His spiritual advisor would later call it torture, describing how Smith's body fought desperately against the gas killing him. At 8:25 p.m., 32 minutes after the nitrogen began flowing, Kenneth Eugene Smith was pronounced dead. Alabama officials declared the execution a success. Critics called it barbaric, but Smith's execution was only the beginning, because 3 more men were scheduled to die in 2024, and each of their stories held darkness that would make Kenneth Smith's death seem like just the opening act. February 21, 1994, Huntsville, Alabama, a wooded area off Interstate 59, where the trees grow thick and the silence is heavy enough to swallow screams. A motorist pulled over to check what looked like debris scattered across the shoulder. As he approached, his stomach turned. What he thought were discarded clothes were actually body parts. A torso, limbs, pieces of a human being left like trash on the side of the highway. The victim was Vicky DeBlow, a 37-year-old hitchhiker from Louisiana, traveling to visit her mother in Tennessee. She had made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from 4 teenagers near Chatham, Alabama. Those teenagers were Carrie Dale Grayson, 17 years old, Kenny Loggins, 17, Trace Duncan, 17, and Louis Mangione, 16. 4 boys looking for excitement on a Friday night. What they found instead was an opportunity for evil that none of them had the strength to resist. Vicky climbed into their car thinking she was one step closer to her mother. Instead, she was entering a nightmare that would end with her body dismembered and scattered like animal remains. The four boys drove Vicky to a secluded area in Bald Rock, Alabama. What happened there was so horrific that when investigators interviewed the suspects, even hardened detectives had to step outside to compose themselves. The boys attacked Vicky, beating her savagely. They took turns assaulting her sexually. When she begged for mercy, they laughed. When she screamed, they hit her harder. They threw her off a cliff, watching as her body tumbled over rocks and branches, breaking apart on the way down. But Vicky DeBlow refused to die easily. Somehow, impossibly, she survived the fall. Broken, bleeding, barely conscious, but alive. The boys climbed down after her and found her clinging to life. That's when Carrie Dale Grayson decided to finish what they'd started. He stomped on her face repeatedly, crushing her skull beneath his boot. The medical examiner would later count over 100 stab wounds on Vicky's body. Her fingers had been cut off, her lungs removed. The brutality was so extreme that prosecutors struggled to find words to describe it in court. After murdering Vicky, the four teenagers mutilated her corpse, cutting her body into pieces and scattering the remains along the highway like she was nothing, like she had never been a daughter, a sister, a human being with dreams and people who loved her. Then they went home and slept peacefully, as if they'd done nothing more than vandalized a mailbox. But murder leaves traces that can't be washed away. Within days, investigators connected the body parts to Vicky DeBlow through fingerprints. They tracked her last known movements and identified the four teenagers who had given her a ride. Under interrogation, the boys turned on each other instantly. Loggins, Duncan, and Monjoni claimed Carrie Dale Grayson was the ringleader, the one who orchestrated the violence and urged them on. Grayson, in turn, tried to minimize his role, but the evidence painted a different picture. The medical examiner's report made it clear that all four had participated in the torture and murder. All four were arrested and charged with capital murder. But because three of them were under 18, only Carrie Dale Grayson faced the death penalty. Alabama law at the time allowed for the execution of 17-year-olds. The others received life sentences. Grayson's trial was swift and brutal. The prosecution presented crime scene photos that made jurors weep. Vicky's mother testified, her voice breaking as she described the daughter who would never make it home. The defense tried to argue that Grayson had been influenced by the others, that he was just a teenager making a terrible mistake. The jury didn't buy it. In 1996, Carrie Dale Grayson was sentenced to death. He would spend the next 28 years on Alabama's death row, filing appeal after appeal, each one denied. And as the years passed, Alabama was preparing to use him for another experiment in execution. After Kenneth Smith's nitrogen hypoxia execution in January 2024, Alabama officials declared the method a success despite the violent convulsions and prolonged suffering. They were ready to use it again. Carrie Dale Grayson became the second man scheduled to die by nitrogen gas. As November 21, 2024 approached, Grayson's legal team fought desperately to stop the execution. They pointed to Smith's death, to the 2 minutes of violent shaking, to witnesses who described it as torture. They argued that nitrogen hypoxia was still experimental, still untested, still cruel. But Alabama's courts had already made up their minds. The execution would proceed. Meanwhile, in Texas, another execution was moving forward, but this one would be different. Travis James Mullis had stopped fighting. September 16, 2024. Huntsville, Texas, the state known as America's execution capital. Travis Mullis, a 38-year-old man convicted of murdering his 3-month-old son, sat in his cell writing final letters. Unlike most death row inmates who exhaust every appeal, Mullis had waived his right to further legal challenges. He wanted to die. In January 2008, Mullis was driving through Texas with his infant son, Elijah. The baby wouldn't stop crying. Mullis, frustrated and enraged, pulled over on the side of the road. He sexually assaulted his own son, then stomped on the infant's head, crushing his skull. He threw the tiny body into a ditch and drove away. When arrested, Mullis confessed immediately, showing no remorse. During his trial, Mullis sat expressionless as prosecutors described his crime in detail. When asked if he had anything to say, he remained silent. The jury sentenced him to death, and Mullis accepted it without protest. For 16 years, he sat on death row, refusing to file appeals, refusing to fight. He told prison officials he deserved to die for what he'd done. On September 16, 2024, Travis Mullis was executed by lethal injection. His final words were brief. "I failed you as a father. I destroyed the most precious gift given to me. I'm sorry." At 7:01 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Texas officials called it a textbook execution. Smooth, quick, painless. But across the country in Utah, another execution was being planned, and this one would bring back a method many thought had been buried in America's past. Taberon Honie, a 49-year-old man convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend's mother in 1998, was scheduled to die on August 8, 2024. But Utah offered him a choice that seemed pulled from a Western film: lethal injection or firing squad. Honie chose the firing squad. On July 9, 1998, Honie broke into the home of Carol Picuvit in Cedar City, Utah. He was high on methamphetamine and cocaine, enraged that his ex-girlfriend had ended their relationship. When he couldn't find her, he took his fury out on her mother. He sexually assaulted Carol, then stabbed her repeatedly while her 3 grandchildren slept in the next room. One of those children, a 2-year-old girl, wandered into the room and witnessed the final moments of her grandmother's murder. Honie fled but was arrested hours later, covered in blood. He confessed immediately, showing no emotion as he described killing Carol. During his trial, prosecutors presented the testimony of the young girl who had witnessed the murder. She was only 6 years old when she took the stand, but her words were devastating. The jury sentenced Honie to death. For 26 years, Honie sat on Utah's death row, filing appeal after appeal. But in 2024, his options ran out. Utah offered him a choice between lethal injection and the firing squad, a method the state had kept legal as a backup option. Honie chose the bullets. On August 8, 2024, Taberon Honie was strapped into a chair in Utah's execution chamber. A white target was placed over his heart. 5 anonymous marksmen took position behind a wall, their rifles aimed through small openings. One rifle contained a blank, so none of the shooters would know for certain if they fired the fatal shot. At 12:15 a.m., the order was given. 5 shots rang out simultaneously. Honie's body jerked violently, then went still. Blood soaked through his prison uniform. He was pronounced dead at 12:16 a.m., making him the first person executed by firing squad in Utah since 2010. His final words had been simple: "I apologize to the Picuvit family for the pain I caused, but apologies don't bring back the dead." And as 2024 drew to a close, America found itself facing uncomfortable questions about the methods it used to execute its condemned. Kenneth Smith's nitrogen hypoxia execution had sparked international outrage, with human rights organizations calling it torture. But Alabama wasn't backing down. On November 21, 2024, they brought Dale Grayson to the execution chamber for the second nitrogen hypoxia execution in American history. Grayson was strapped to the same gurney where Kenneth Smith had died. The same mask was placed over his face. The same nitrogen gas began to flow. But this time, something different happened. Grayson didn't convulse as violently as Smith. Witnesses reported he shook for approximately 30 seconds before losing consciousness. At 6:33 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Alabama officials declared it proof that nitrogen hypoxia was becoming more refined, more humane. But Grayson's final words, spoken moments before the mask was placed over his face, told a different story. He looked directly at the warden and said, "You're about to kill me with an experimental method. The world will remember this as torture." 4 men, 4 execution methods. Kenneth Smith and Dale Grayson by nitrogen gas. Travis Mullis by lethal injection. Taberon Honie by firing squad. Each death carried its own horror. Each raised questions about what justice really means when the state becomes the executioner. But there's more to this story than just the methods of death. There are patterns emerging, questions that nobody wants to answer, and a final twist that will make you question everything you thought you knew about capital punishment in America. 2024 wasn't supposed to be a landmark year for American executions. The death penalty had been declining for decades. Public support was wavering. States were moving away from capital punishment, not toward it. And yet, in 12 months, America executed 25 people across 5 states, with 4 of those executions making history for reasons that should terrify anyone paying attention. Because this isn't just about 4 men who committed terrible crimes. This is about what happens when justice becomes experimentation. When the machinery of death starts searching for new ways to kill, because the old ways have broken down. And when you look closely at the patterns emerging from 2024, you realize something chilling. America's death penalty system isn't evolving toward humanity. It's regressing into something far darker. Let's start with the obvious question nobody wants to ask. Why did Alabama need nitrogen hypoxia in the first place? The answer takes us back to 2018, when pharmaceutical companies across Europe and the United States refused to supply drugs used in lethal injections. They didn't want their medications, designed to heal, being used to kill. States scrambled for alternatives. Some turned to compounding pharmacies willing to create untested drug cocktails in secret. Others, like Oklahoma, used midazolam, a sedative that multiple botched executions proved was inadequate for the task. Inmates seized, gasped for air, and took up to 43 minutes to die, while witnesses watched in horror. Alabama had its own problems with lethal injection. Between 2018 and 2022, the state botched multiple executions, including Kenneth Smith's first attempt in November 2022. For 4 hours, prison staff stabbed needles into Smith's body, searching for veins that had collapsed from years of drug use and age. Smith remained conscious throughout, feeling every jab, every failure. When Alabama finally called off the execution at midnight, Smith returned to his cell traumatized but alive. The state was humiliated. They needed a solution that didn't rely on drugs they could obtain or veins they could find. That's when Alabama turned to nitrogen hypoxia, a method that had never been tested on humans, never been studied for its effects on consciousness and pain, never been proven to be anything other than a theory someone once proposed as humane. Kenneth Smith became the guinea pig. And when witnesses described his 2 minutes of violent convulsions, his gasping for air, his body writhing against restraints, Alabama officials didn't see torture. They saw a learning opportunity. They declared the execution a success, and immediately scheduled Carrie Dale Grayson for the same fate. Grayson's execution in November showed slight improvements. He convulsed for only 30 seconds instead of 2 minutes. Alabama claimed this proved the method was becoming more refined. But medical experts who reviewed the executions pointed out something disturbing. Nitrogen hypoxia executions were still taking significantly longer than lethal injections, and the visible suffering contradicted every claim about the method being quick and painless. Dr. Joel Zivit, an anesthesiologist who has studied execution methods extensively, reviewed witness statements from both nitrogen executions. His conclusion was damning. What we're seeing is suffocation. The body's natural response to oxygen deprivation is panic, convulsions, and desperate attempts to breathe. Calling this humane is like calling drowning peaceful, because the person eventually stops struggling. But Alabama wasn't alone in experimenting with controversial execution methods in 2024. Utah's decision to offer Taberon Honie a choice between lethal injection and firing squad seemed almost quaint by comparison, a throwback to frontier justice. But the reality was more complicated. Utah had maintained firing squad as a backup option specifically because of the lethal injection drug shortage. When Honie chose the bullets, Utah became one of only 4 states willing to use this method, alongside Mississippi, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. The firing squad execution was efficient, violent, and undeniably effective. 5 bullets tore through Honie's chest simultaneously, shredding his heart and lungs. Death was nearly instantaneous, but the image of a man strapped to a chair with the target over his heart, shot by anonymous marksmen, felt like something from a different century. It raised questions about what Americans were willing to accept in the name of justice. And then there was Travis Mullis in Texas, the man who wanted to die. Texas executed 8 people in 2024, more than any other state. But Mullis's case highlighted something uniquely disturbing about America's death penalty system: the number of inmates who volunteer for execution, who waive their appeals and essentially commit suicide by asking the state to kill them. Mullis had spent 16 years on death row for murdering his infant son. He had refused all appeals, refused all attempts by anti-death penalty lawyers to intervene on his behalf. He told prison officials repeatedly that he deserved to die, that living with what he'd done was worse than execution. On September 16, 2024, Texas granted his wish. But here is what makes this disturbing: approximately 11% of all executions since 1976 have been volunteers, people who dropped their appeals and asked to die. Some were racked with guilt, like Mullis. Others were simply tired of living in a 6-by-8-foot cell for decades. And some were severely mentally ill, suffering from depression, schizophrenia, or other conditions that made them unable to rationally participate in their own defense. The Supreme Court has ruled that executing someone who is mentally incompetent violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. But volunteering for execution creates a legal loophole. If an inmate says they want to die, courts assume they're competent enough to make that choice, even when psychiatric evaluations suggest otherwise. Travis Mullis's execution was called textbook, smooth, painless. But nobody asked whether a man who stomped his own infant son to death was mentally sound enough to decide his own fate. Nobody questioned whether the state should be in the business of assisted suicide for people consumed by guilt or mental illness. Which brings us to the most disturbing pattern of all: the demographics of who gets executed in America. Of the 25 people executed in 2024, 22 were white, 2 were black, and 1 was Hispanic. This might seem to contradict the well-documented racial disparities in death penalty sentencing, where black defendants are far more likely to receive death sentences than white defendants for similar crimes. But the explanation reveals something even more troubling. Death row is still disproportionately black and brown, but the people who actually make it to the execution chamber are increasingly white volunteers or white defendants convicted of crimes so heinous that appeals courts have little room to intervene. The system has become better at avoiding the execution of potentially innocent people or those with strong mitigating circumstances, but only because those cases get stuck in appeals for decades while the volunteers and the undeniably guilty get rushed to their deaths. Kenneth Smith spent 35 years on death row. Grayson spent 28 years. Taberon Honie spent 26 years. The system ground forward slowly, wearing down appeals, exhausting legal options, until finally executing them with methods that raised more questions than they answered. And here's the twist that nobody saw coming. In December 2024, just weeks after Grayson's execution, a bipartisan group of Alabama legislators introduced a bill to place a moratorium on nitrogen hypoxia executions pending further study. Not because they opposed the death penalty, but because international pressure and mounting evidence of suffering had become impossible to ignore. The United Nations had condemned the executions as potential violations of international law. The European Union had issued formal protests. Medical organizations worldwide had called nitrogen hypoxia experimental torture. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey dismissed the bill immediately, calling it an insult to the victims' families and a waste of legislative time. The moratorium died in committee without ever reaching a vote. Alabama scheduled 2 more nitrogen hypoxia executions for 2025, but something had shifted in the national conversation. For the first time in decades, Americans were watching executions closely, questioning not just whether the death penalty should exist, but what it says about a society willing to experiment with new ways to kill its own citizens. Kenneth Smith's spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, became an unlikely voice in this debate. He had stood beside Smith in the execution chamber, watching him convulse and gasp through the mask. In interviews afterward, Hood described feeling complicit in torture, of witnessing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He called for the complete abolition of the death penalty, not from a place of sympathy for murderers, but from the conviction that no government should have the power to kill in ways that cause unnecessary suffering. Vicky DeBlow family, meanwhile, issued a statement after Carrie Dale Grayson's execution. They expressed relief that justice had been served, but also noted that Grayson's death didn't bring Vicky back. It didn't erase the horror of what happened to her in those woods in 1994. It didn't heal the trauma of knowing how she died. It simply ended one life in response to another life being ended, perpetuating a cycle that left everyone damaged. And that's perhaps the most haunting truth of all. Elizabeth Sennett is still dead. Vicky DeBlow is still dead. Elijah Mullis is still dead. Carol Pickuvit is still dead. Their killers are now dead too, but the families left behind remain trapped in their grief, told that execution brings closure when it really just brings another body to bury and another set of nightmares to process. 2024 proved that America's death penalty isn't becoming more humane. It's becoming more desperate. States are searching for new ways to kill because the old ways have broken down, experimenting with methods that would be illegal to use on animals in most jurisdictions. Nitrogen hypoxia, firing squads, and tested drug cocktails, all while pretending that this is about justice rather than vengeance. Dressed in legal clothing. 4 men died in 2024 in ways that made headlines around the world. Kenneth Smith and Carrie Dale Grayson suffocated slowly under nitrogen masks while their bodies convulsed. Travis Mullis volunteered for a lethal injection that ended his guilt-ridden existence. Taberon Honie took 5 bullets to the chest in a scene that belonged in a Western movie, not a modern justice system. Their crimes were undeniably horrific. Their victims deserved justice. But when the machinery of death becomes a laboratory for experimentation, when executions become public spectacles that horrify international observers, when the state rushes to kill volunteers who may not be mentally competent to make that choice, something has gone terribly wrong. The question isn't whether these 4 men deserve to die. The question is whether any government should have the power to kill in these ways, using methods that cause visible suffering, that take minutes instead of seconds, that turn execution chambers into testing grounds for theories about humane death that fail in practice. And here is the final truth that will stay with you long after this video ends. In 2025, at least 60 people are scheduled for execution across the United States. Some will die by lethal injection. Some will face nitrogen hypoxia. Some might choose firing squads. And all of them will die knowing they're not just being punished for their crimes. They're being used as test subjects in America's ongoing experiment with death. If this story made you think, made you question, or made you uncomfortable, that's exactly what it should do. Hit that subscribe button, because next week, we're diving into the case that Alabama doesn't want you to know about. The execution. They tried 3 times before finally succeeding, and the evidence that suggests they might have killed an innocent man. Drop a comment telling me your thoughts on capital punishment, whether you think nitrogen hypoxia is humane or torture, and whether the death penalty has any place in modern society. This conversation is just beginning, and your voice matters. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop searching for the truth.